The wind across the Montana plains in 1887 didn't just carry the cold, it carried secrets. And in a valley carved by glaciers and forgotten by most, a giant of a man lived alone. His name was Samuel Big Sam Mackenzie. At 6 feet, 8 inches tall, he was a local legend, a man built of oak and iron who had carved a 1,500-acre ranch from the unforgiving wilderness with his bare hands. He was a monument of a man, casting a shadow that could swallow a horse and wagon whole. But the locals, who only saw him on rare trips to town, didn't know the truth about Big Sam. They didn't know about the suffocating silence in his cabin, a silence left behind by his wife, Martha, who'd been taken by a fever 3 years earlier. They didn't know that his massive chest housed a heart shattered by loneliness. And they certainly didn't know that for the last 48 hours, he was being watched. From the rocky ridge that bordered his property, 12 pairs of desperate eyes tracked his every move. They were children, and they were starving. The oldest, a boy of 13, named Thomas Whitehorse, pressed his back against the cold granite. The weight on his shoulders was heavier than any rock. It was the weight of 11 other lives. Behind him, huddled in a shallow cave, the others shivered. The youngest, little Mary Crow Feather, was only 4. She clutched a worn-out corn husk doll, her face gaunt, her eyes holding an exhaustion no child should ever know. For 3 weeks they had been running. They were ghosts, slipping through a world that had forgotten them. One morning, soldiers had descended on their settlement near the Judith River. Their parents were taken, sent to work the railroad camps. A temporary assignment, the captain had said. The children he'd promised would be cared for at a mission school. But Thomas had heard the soldiers talking. He heard the truth. There was no mission school. There were only government boarding schools, places designed to strip them of their language, their culture, their names, places where Cherokee children went in and broken strangers came out, if they came out at all. So Thomas had made a choice. In the chaos, he gathered the youngest ones and melted into the wilderness. Now, 3 weeks later, hope was as thin as their worn-out clothes. They had survived on roots and berries, but winter was coming. A hungry sickness had taken hold. Little Joseph Quietstream, only 5, had a cough that rattled his tiny frame, a dry, sharp sound that echoed the dying leaves on the trees. For 2 days they had watched the giant below. Stories said he was mean as a grizzly, that he'd killed a man for looking at him wrong. But Thomas had seen the way the giant's massive hands were gentle with his chickens. He saw the slump in his shoulders as he sat on his porch at dusk, the posture of a man drowning in his own invisible grief. "He's lonely," 10-year-old Sarah Gentlerain had whispered. "Lonely people can be dangerous," Thomas had replied. But now they were out of time. Joseph's cough was worse. Mary had stumbled twice yesterday, her small legs giving out. They couldn't run anymore. They had to make a choice. Trust the giant or fade away on this cold ridge. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and red, Thomas looked down at the ranch. The sturdy cabin, the fat cattle, the promise of food and warmth. It was a paradise, and it was a trap. He had to decide, and he had to decide now. Then, as if he'd heard Thomas's thoughts, the giant stopped his work. He looked directly up at the ridge, directly at their hiding spot. Thomas's heart stopped. They were caught. It was over. But the man didn't shout. He didn't raise a rifle. He simply stood there, a silhouette against the dying light. He raised one enormous hand, not in anger, but in what looked like a greeting. Then he turned, walked to a tree stump at the edge of his property, and set down a large metal bucket. He went back to his cabin and disappeared inside, leaving the bucket behind. An offering, a test, a choice that would change everything. He knows we're here, Thomas thought, his mind racing. He knows, and he isn't afraid. The only question left was, should they be afraid of him? The milk in the bucket was still warm. Thomas crept down from the ridge under the cloak of pre-dawn darkness, his feet making no sound on the frost-covered grass. The white liquid gleamed in the starlight, and the smell of it made his stomach clench with a hunger so sharp it was a physical pain. He'd left the others in the cave with Sarah in charge. He'd promised to be back by sunrise. If he didn't return, she was to take them west, toward the mythical valley from his grandmother's stories. A beautiful lie he'd been telling them to keep hope alive. But kneeling there, Seeing his own gaunt face reflected in the milk, he knew there was no going west. Not for Mary, who could barely walk. Not for Joseph, whose cough had worsened through the night. This was their last chance. He cupped his hands and drank. It was the most wonderful thing he had ever tasted. Warmth spread through him, a feeling so foreign he'd almost forgotten it. For a single fleeting moment, he allowed himself to imagine a life where this wasn't a miracle, but a morning routine. "Tastes good, doesn't it?" The voice was deep and gentle, but it came from directly behind him. Thomas shot to his feet, spinning around, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The giant stood 10 feet away, his massive frame blotting out the stars. Up close, he was even more imposing. His shoulders were as broad as a barn door. His hands could crush a man's skull, but his eyes were kind. "Easy, son," Sam said, holding up a hand the size of a shovel. "Not going to hurt you. Just wanted to see if you were real." Every instinct screamed at Thomas to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. He straightened to his full height, which barely reached the giant's belt buckle. "My name is Thomas Whitehorse," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I thank you for the milk." Sam's eyebrows rose. "Whitehorse? That's Cherokee, isn't it?" Thomas nodded, wary. This was usually the part where things went wrong. "My wife," Sam said, his voice softening, "she knew some Cherokee folks. Taught her how to weave baskets from rivergrass. Good people." The casual acceptance, the description of his people as good people, threw Thomas off balance. He didn't know how to react. "Where are the others?" Sam asked. Thomas's blood ran cold. "Others?" A small smile touched Sam's lips. "Son, I've been tracking game in these hills for 15 years. I know the difference between one set of tracks and a dozen." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, familiar object. Mary's corn husk doll. "Figured this didn't belong to a 13-year-old boy," Sam said gently. Thomas's mind raced. It was over. He had failed them. "How many?" Sam asked, his voice losing its casual tone, replaced by an urgent concern. "How many children are with you?" The sincerity in his voice broke through Thomas's fear. 11, he admitted, his voice cracking. "The youngest is 4. Sam's face grew troubled. A shadow passed over his kind eyes. "4 years old? Out here? In this weather?" "We had no choice," Thomas said, a sudden defensiveness rising in him. "They were going to take us. To the boarding schools." Sam nodded slowly, a deep understanding dawning in his expression. "Ah, I've heard about those places. Not kind to Indian children." The way he said it, not as a category but as people deserving kindness, made something in Thomas's chest unclench. Still, he had to ask, the question that mattered more than anything. "Are you going to turn us in?" Sam was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the mountains where the sun was just beginning to touch the peaks with gold. "My wife," he said finally, "used to say the measure of a man isn't what he can take, but what he gives. She'd haunt me from the grave if I turned away hungry children." He looked down at Thomas. "How long since you've all had a proper meal?" "A week, maybe more." "And the little ones, how are they?" The genuine worry in the giant's voice was the final crack in Thomas's wall of suspicion. "Not well," he whispered. "Mary can barely walk. And Joseph, he has a cough." Sam's jaw tightened. He swore softly under his breath. "Well, we can't have that." He turned and started walking toward the cabin with long, purposeful strides. "Come on." Thomas hesitated. This could be a trap. But then Sam turned back on the porch, and Thomas saw it. He saw fear in the giant's face. Not fear of them. Fear for them. "The others are in the cave," Thomas called out. "They're scared." Sam nodded. "Tell you what, I'll make breakfast. Biscuits, bacon, eggs, the works. When you smell it cooking, you bring them down. If they're still scared, they can eat on the porch. But nobody should be hungry when there's food to spare." He paused at the door, his massive frame filling the entire opening. "Thomas?" "Yes, sir. My name's Sam, and for what it's worth, I think you're the bravest boy I've ever met." With that, he disappeared inside, leaving Thomas standing in the growing dawn, with Mary's doll in his hand and a strange, fragile thing blooming in his chest. It felt a lot like hope. The smell of frying bacon was the first thing to reach them, a scent so rich and wonderful it felt like a dream. Then came the aroma of fresh biscuits, warm and buttery. The children's stomachs growled in a mournful chorus. Little Mary started to cry, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief that food was real and it was close. Thomas led them down the hill. It was a heartbreaking procession. 12 ghosts walking back into the world of the living, their clothes in tatters, their faces etched with a hunger that went bone deep. Sam watched them come from his kitchen window. He'd cooked enough food to feed a team of lumberjacks, but looking at their hollow cheeks, he wondered if it would be enough. He stepped out onto the porch, moving slowly, keeping his hands in sight like he would with a spooked horse. The children stopped 20 feet away, bunching together, a small, frightened herd. "Good morning," Sam said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm Sam. Thomas told me you might be hungry." The silence was absolute, broken only by the sizzle of the bacon and the sound of Joseph's ragged breathing. Then little Mary, who was being carried by Sarah, lifted her head. She looked directly at the giant with her two old eyes and spoke a truth so simple and devastating it hit Sam like a punch to the gut. "We're starving, sir." "Not we're hungry. We're starving." Sam's throat tightened. "Well then," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "we'd better do something about that." He turned and went back inside, leaving the door wide open. An invitation, a show of trust. He heard them whispering in Cherokee, a rapid, urgent debate. Thomas's voice calm and steady, Anna's sharp with caution. "Thomas," Sam called from the kitchen, "could you give me a hand? I figure the porch might feel safer for breakfast." A moment later, Thomas appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of determined courage. "The others want to know if you're alone." "Just me," Sam said, loading a platter with biscuits. "Haven't had company in a long time. They want to know if soldiers are coming." Sam stopped what he was doing and turned to face the boy. "Son, I give you my word. No soldiers are coming. No one knows you're here, and no one will." Thomas searched his face, then nodded. "They also want to know why you're helping us." Sam looked past him, out at the 11 other children clustered in his yard, at Mary's pale face and Joseph's thin shoulders. "Because," he said slowly, "my wife, Martha, would have wanted me to. Now take these out to your family. I'll bring the rest." Family. The word had just slipped out, but as Thomas carried the platter of biscuits outside, Sam realized it was the truest word he'd spoken in years. What happened next was something Sam would never forget. The children ate with a desperate, silent efficiency. They didn't fight over the food, they shared. The older ones instinctively passed the best pieces to the younger ones. Sarah cut Mary's bacon into tiny bites. Daniel positioned himself at the edge of the porch, still standing guard even as he ate. They ate like ghosts at a feast, their movements quick and quiet, as if they expected it all to be snatched away at any moment. When the initial frenzy subsided, Sam asked their names. Thomas introduced them one by one, a litany of beautiful sad names. Mary Crowfeather, Joseph Quiet Stream, Sarah Gentle Rain, Anna and Lisa, Deer Path. They were a tapestry of displaced tribes, children of a scattered nation, now huddled together on his porch. Sam looked out at his ranch, the sturdy barns, the fat cattle, the vast empty land. He had so much. They had nothing. "How would you all feel," he asked, the words feeling bigger and more important than any he'd ever spoken, "about staying here for a while? Just until you figure out what comes next. I've got more room than I know what to do with, and this place has been too quiet for too long." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't fear. It was the sound of children who didn't dare to hope. It was Mary who spoke, her small voice cutting through the tension. "You mean we can stay? All of us? Together? All of you? Together," Sam confirmed, "for as long as you need." And for the first time, Sam saw something other than hunger and terror in their eyes. He saw the dawning of something that looked a lot like home. That night, Sam gave them the barn loft, spreading fresh hay in every blanket he owned. It was warm and dry, but they huddled together in the center of the vast space, a tight knot of fear, unable to relax. When Sam climbed the ladder to check on them, 12 pairs of eyes gleamed back at him from the darkness. None of them were sleeping. Listening, Thomas said when Sam asked what was wrong. For horses? For soldiers? Sam's heart ached. They had forgotten how to rest. There's nobody coming, he said, his voice firm. You're under my protection now. How do we know you won't change your mind? Anna asked, her voice sharp with the memory of broken promises. It was a fair question. Sam went back down the ladder, but instead of returning to his empty cabin, he pulled a chair onto the porch, settled in with his rifle across his lap, and prepared to stand watch. The next morning, Thomas found him there, asleep in the chair, covered in dew. The sight of the giant who had guarded them through the night seemed to break something loose in the children. A routine began to form. The children, desperate to contribute, took over the smaller chores. Thomas had a natural gift with horses. Sarah had a green thumb, coaxing late-season vegetables from the garden. The twins, Michael and Matthew, took charge of collecting eggs. The ranch, once a monument to Sam's loneliness, slowly came back to life. It filled with the sound of children's voices, hesitant at first, then growing stronger each day. Joseph's cough began to fade, replaced by a tentative laugh. Mary's hollow cheeks filled out. They were healing, not just their bodies but their spirits. Sam learned their stories. He learned that Anna wanted to be a teacher, that Lisa could sing in 4 languages, that Peter dreamed of being a doctor, that Thomas wanted land of his own, a place where Cherokee children could be safe. One evening, 7-year-old Rebecca Moonbeam, a girl with a mind as sharp as a newly honed blade, asked him about Martha. Did she want children? Rebecca asked, her dark eyes searching his face. More than anything, Sam admitted, the old ache returning. We lost 3. That's why you help us, Rebecca said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. We're the children she couldn't have. The truth of it hit Sam with the force of a physical blow. Maybe she was right. The days grew colder, and the first snow of the season arrived, blanketing the valley in a pristine sheet of white. Sam woke to a sound he hadn't heard in years. Laughter. He looked out to see all 12 of them in the yard, faces turned to the sky, catching snowflakes on their tongues. They were not refugees. They were not survivors. They were just children, experiencing the simple magic of the first snow. And as he watched them, a feeling of deep, quiet joy filled the empty spaces in his heart. He had offered them food, and in return, they had given him back his life. He had a family. It wasn't the one he and Martha had dreamed of, but it was the family he needed. But what none of them knew was that their fragile peace was about to be shattered. 100 miles away, in the territorial capital of Helena, a man was reading a report about 12 missing Cherokee children, and he was drawing a circle on a map, a circle that was closing in on the Mackenzie Ranch. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a postal rider shocked to find a yard full of children at the famously solitary Mackenzie Ranch. The envelope was thick, the seal on the back made of red wax, stamped with the emblem of the United States territorial government. Sam's blood ran cold before he even opened it. He walked into the barn where the children were working. Thomas was teaching the younger ones to braid rope. Anna was mending a shirt. Lisa was humming a Cherokee lullaby. It was a scene of perfect, peaceful domesticity, a scene that was about to end. He read the letter. The words were cold, bureaucratic, and utterly terrifying. It has come to the attention of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Harboring Cherokee children, subjects of federal custody, required by law to attend government educational facilities. Agent Harrison Caldwell will arrive within the week to collect any Indian children. Within the week, it could be tomorrow. Bad news? Thomas asked, appearing silently at his side. The boy had learned to read adult faces like a tracker reads the trail. Sam gathered them all in the barn. He explained the letter, and he watched the light of hope, so recently kindled, die in their eyes. We could run again, Daniel suggested, but the words were hollow. They all knew what that meant. Cold, hunger, fear. I don't want to be hungry again, Mary whispered, her small voice breaking the heavy silence. Sam knelt down in front of her. You won't be, little one, I promise. But how? How could he keep that promise? A lone rancher against the full force of the federal government? It was impossible. And then, a crazy, desperate idea began to form in his mind. An idea so audacious it might just work. What if, he said slowly, looking at the 12 faces turned toward him, you weren't Cherokee children in government custody? What if you were something else entirely? Thomas frowned. What do you mean? I mean, Sam said, his voice gaining strength, what if you were my children? Legally, adopted, citizens of Montana with the right to live wherever your father chooses. The silence in the barn was absolute. They stared at him, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and a wild, desperate hope. Can you do that? Sarah whispered. I don't know, Sam admitted, but I know a man who might. Judge Morrison and Helena. If anyone can find a way, it's him. But we're Cherokee, Lisa said, her voice filled with a fierce pride. We can't stop being Cherokee. I wouldn't want you to, Sam said firmly. This isn't about changing who you are. It's about using the white man's law to protect you. The weight of the decision settled on them. Then Thomas, standing tall, his 13-year-old frame carrying the gravity of a tribal elder, spoke. We need to vote. The vote was unanimous. Sam saddled his fastest horse. The ride to Helena was 2 days of hard pushing, but he rode through the night, a man possessed. He had to beat Caldwell. He had to. He arrived at Judge Thaddeus Morrison's office at dawn, covered in dust and sweat. The judge was a small, neat man with eyes that missed nothing. He listened to Sam's story without interruption. 12 children, Morrison mused when Sam had finished, and a federal agent on his way. This is complicated, Sam. Can it be done, Thad? The judge was silent for a long time. Legally, perhaps. There are precedents. But the federal claim of custody trumps territorial law. It's a hornet's nest. Then we'll kick the nest. Morrison saw the iron resolve in Sam's eyes. It would require speed. We'd have to file the adoption papers and have them registered before Caldwell even sets foot on your ranch. It's a race against the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy always has a head start. They worked through the night. Morrison called in clerks and scribes, pulling strings, calling in favors, pushing paperwork through channels that usually took weeks. Just as dawn was breaking, Morrison slid a final stack of papers across his desk. One more thing, Sam. They'll need new legal names. Anglo names, for the court documents. It was a bitter pill, but Sam knew it was necessary. Mackenzie, he said, his voice thick. Their surname will be Mackenzie. All 12 of them. Sam rode back with a leather satchel full of legal documents that declared him the father of 12 children. He was no longer just their protector. He was their father. But as he crested the final ridge and saw his ranch spread out below him, his heart leaped into his throat. He saw riders, 3 of them, and a covered wagon. They were already there. He was too late. Agent Harrison Caldwell dismounted with the stiff posture of a man who believed order was the only thing holding back chaos. He was thin, with pale, dissecting eyes. Behind him, 2 federal marshals sat on their horses, their hands resting near their sidearms. Standing by the wagon was a stern-faced woman in a black dress, a matron from the boarding schools, her face a grim mask of certainty. The wagon was empty, waiting to be filled. Sam strode out to meet them, deliberately placing his massive body between them and the barn, where he knew 12 children were hiding, holding their breath. Mr. Samuel Mackenzie, Caldwell stated, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. That's me. I am Agent Caldwell. I trust you received our correspondence. I did, Sam said, his voice calm and steady. Though I'm afraid there's been some confusion. Caldwell's thin eyebrow arched. Confusion? There are no Cherokee children in federal custody on this land, Agent Caldwell. Sam paused, letting the words hang in the cold air. There are, however, 12 children who belong to me. My children, legally adopted. The silence that followed was heavy with shock and disbelief. Caldwell's face, which had been a mask of bureaucratic certainty, twisted into a sneer. That's impossible. These children are wards of the federal government. You can't simply adopt them. I think you'll find, Sam said, slowly reaching into his coat, that territorial law disagrees. He pulled out the leather folder filled with the papers Judge Morrison had prepared, the official seals gleaming in the weak sunlight. Adoption papers, filed and registered with the territorial court in Helena. Judge Morrison himself presided. Caldwell snatched the folder, his fingers tearing through the documents with frantic energy. Sam watched as the man's composure crumbled, his face growing paler as he saw the undeniable legality of it all. Every signature, every seal, every form was perfect. This is an outrage. A trick, Caldwell sputtered. These children were already under federal jurisdiction. Actually, they weren't, a new voice cut in. All heads turned. Riding up the path on a steady gray mare was the small, unimposing figure of Judge Thaddeus Morrison. Good morning, Agent Caldwell, the judge said pleasantly. I make it a point to attend important family gatherings. Caldwell was floored. Judge Morrison, this is preposterous. These are Indian children. They belong in schools where they can be civilized. These, the judge corrected him, his voice as sharp as a razor, are American citizens, legally adopted by a respected landowner. Their ethnicity has no bearing on their legal status. Just then, the barn door creaked open. Thomas stepped out, his young face set with a courage that defied his years. One by one, the others followed him, Sarah carrying Mary, the twins flanking Rebecca, Anna and Lisa, their heads held high. They arranged themselves beside Sam, a silent, unbroken line. A family. These are my children, Sam said, his voice booming across the yard. And he named them one by one, giving each their full legal name, their Cherokee heritage preserved as a middle name, their new surname a shield. Thomas Whitehorse Mackenzie, Sarah Gentle Rain Mackenzie, Mary Crow Feather Mackenzie. Caldwell stared at them, his plan, his entire worldview, falling apart before his eyes. But they're Indians, he stammered, the word hanging in the air like a curse. A small, choked sob came from behind Sam. It was Mary. A fire ignited in Sam's chest, a rage so pure and protective it felt like lightning. They are my children, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that made even the marshals shift uneasily. And you will not speak of them in that tone. Not on my property. Caldwell, realizing he had lost, tried to regain some shred of authority. This isn't over, Mackenzie. The Bureau will not accept this. There will be appeals, investigations. And we will meet every one of them in court, Judge Morrison replied cheerfully. I do so enjoy a good legal fight. Defeated, Caldwell mounted his horse. You're making a mistake, he snarled. You can't civilize them out here in the wilderness. A clear young voice cut through the air. It was Thomas. We aren't trying to be civilized, sir. We are learning to be ourselves. And we are learning that being Cherokee does not make us any less American. As the government party rode away, in a cloud of dust and humiliation, a profound quiet settled over the ranch. Is it really over? Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sam looked at the 12 faces turned up to him, faces filled with trust and relief and a dawning, fragile joy. This part is, Sam said, pulling Mary into a hug. This part is. But as he looked out at the road leading back to town, back to the world that had tried to tear his family apart, he knew the truth. The legal battle was won. But the real war was just beginning. Word travels fast in a place like Montana, and the story of the giant of Copper Ridge and his 12 adopted Cherokee children spread like a wildfire. When Sam rode into Millfield for supplies 3 weeks later, he could feel the change. The town was split down the middle. He felt the cold stares in Brennan's general store. Mrs. Brennan, who had always been polite, now served him with a frosty silence. Then Frank Morrison walked in, a hard-nosed rancher from the next valley, a man whose opinions were as rough as his hands. Well, well, Morrison boomed, loud enough for the whole store to hear. If it isn't Sam Mackenzie, the famous Indian lover. The store went quiet. Every eye turned to Sam. Sam turned slowly to face him. Frank, something I can help you with? I think you've helped enough, Morrison sneered. Bringing all those savages onto decent land. Don't you know what their kind does? It ain't right, Sam. They ain't white. They don't belong here. Sam felt his hands clench into fists. He could see the agreement on the faces of the other customers. The weight of their judgment pressed down on him. He took a deep breath, thinking of Thomas's quiet dignity, of Mary's trusting hand in his. "What they are, Frank," Sam said, his voice dangerously low, "is children. My children. And if you ever speak about my children that way again, you and I are going to have a very serious problem." There was no shouting, no threat of violence, but the promise in Sam's voice was absolute. Morrison, for all his bluster, took a half-step back. Sam paid for his supplies and walked out. The ride home was long and heavy. He had won the legal fight, but he had made himself an outcast in his own community. But the community wasn't entirely against him. On his way out of town, he was stopped by Dr. Hayes, who offered his medical services free of charge. Mrs. Walsh, the school teacher, sent a message offering to come to the ranch twice a week to help with lessons. Even old Pete Harrison, his closest neighbor, had shown up with a haunch of venison and a gruff, "Children are children. Anyone who says different is a fool." He was not entirely alone. When he got back to the ranch, he found the children gathered around the massive kitchen table he'd built, working on their lessons. They were hungry for knowledge, their minds sharp and eager. He told them the truth about his trip to town. He told them that some people would judge them, would hate them, simply for who they were. He watched their faces, expecting to see fear. Instead, he saw defiance. "What if they won't let us go to the regular school?" Sarah asked, a practical question that cut to the heart of their future. "Then we'll build our own school," Sam said, the idea taking root the moment he said it. A place where they wouldn't just be tolerated, but celebrated. A place where their heritage was a strength, not a weakness. "Could we really?" Rebecca asked, her eyes shining with the possibility. "Why not?" Sam said, looking at the circle of determined faces. Anna wanted to be a teacher. Lisa wanted to study law. Thomas was already a better rancher than men twice his age. They wouldn't just survive. They would build something new. That night, Sam knew the fight ahead would be long and hard. They would face prejudice, isolation, and hatred. But looking at his family, at the 12 resilient children who had already overcome so much, he felt a deep, unwavering certainty. Let the world judge them. Together they were stronger than any hate. Together they would build a home so full of love and light that it would have no choice but to push back the darkness. Winter came with a vengeance, burying the valley in a deep, silent blanket of snow. A blizzard howled for 3 days, cutting them off from the world. Inside they were safe and warm. The loft, now a cozy dormitory, was filled with the sound of stories and laughter. Sam told them about Christmases in Ohio. They told him about Cherokee winter ceremonies. They decided they would honor both. On the third night of the storm, a frantic pounding echoed from the cabin door. Sam opened it to find 2 strangers, a man and a woman, their faces blue with cold, their clothes crusted with ice. "Help us," the man gasped. "Our wagon broke down. We've got our 2 children and an elderly couple. The old man is sick. He won't make it through the night." Without a moment's hesitation, Sam turned. "Thomas, hitch the sleigh." The older boys, Thomas, Daniel, and Peter, insisted on coming. "You taught us that neighbors are family when they're in trouble," Thomas said. It was a brutal, treacherous rescue. They fought through howling wind and blinding snow, finally finding the stranded family huddled in their broken wagon, close to death. They brought all 6 of them back to the ranch. As the strangers stumbled into the warmth of the cabin, they were met by Sarah and Anna, who had hot soup and blankets ready. The Henderson children, a boy and a girl, stared in wide-eyed wonder at the Cherokee children, who moved with such quiet competence. "Are they Indians?" the little Henderson girl whispered to her mother. Before her mother could shush her, little Mary stepped forward, her face serious. "We're Cherokee," she said clearly, "but we're also Americans, and we're Sam's children, which makes us your hosts." The simple, profound dignity of the 4-year-old left the adults speechless. Mr. Henderson looked at Sam, his eyes filled with a dawning understanding. "These are your children?" "All 12, Sam confirmed. Over the next 2 days, as the storm raged outside, something miraculous happened inside the cabin. Barriers melted. The Henderson children played with the Mackenzie children. their laughter mingling, their differences forgotten. Mrs. Henderson, who later admitted she'd been raised to fear natives, watched in amazement as Anna and Sarah nursed the sick old man with a skill and tenderness that put most doctors to shame. "I've heard stories," she confessed to Sam on the second evening, "about savagery, but your children, they're the most civilized, kind-hearted young people I have ever met." Thomas, who was helping the old man sip some broth, overheard her. "Civilization isn't about skin color, ma'am," he said quietly. "It's about how you treat people who need your help." When the storm finally broke, the Hendersons prepared to leave. They were not the same people who had arrived. Their fear and prejudice had been replaced by gratitude and a deep, abiding respect. "You've given us more than shelter," Mr. Henderson said, shaking Sam's hand. "You've given us hope that this country might just become what it promises to be." As their wagon disappeared down the snowy road, Sam stood on his porch, surrounded by his 12 children. They had been tested not by hatred, but by a call for kindness, and they had answered it without hesitation. In that moment, Sam knew they would be all right. The world could throw its worst at them, but the foundation they had built, a foundation of love, respect, and shared humanity, was strong enough to withstand any storm. 5 years later, the Mackenzie Ranch was no longer just a ranch. It was a destination. The Copper Ridge Academy stood on a hill overlooking the valley, a beautiful two-story schoolhouse built of stone and timber by Sam, Peter, and the other boys. Inside, Anna Deerpath Mackenzie, now a confident 17-year-old, stood before a class of 23 students. Half were Cherokee. The other half were white, children of local ranchers, who had overcome their prejudice when they saw the quality of the education being offered. "History," Anna was telling them, "is never one single story. It is a chorus of many voices. Our job is to learn to listen to them all." The ranch itself had tripled in size. Thomas, at 18, was Sam's full partner, a brilliant and innovative rancher who blended modern agricultural science with the traditional Cherokee knowledge of land stewardship he'd learned from his elders' stories. The family had thrived. Lisa was in her first year of college, studying to become a lawyer to fight for Native rights. Rebecca was a gifted musician, composing music that wove together Cherokee and European traditions. Joseph, once a sickly child, was now a strong, healthy boy who dreamed of being a doctor. All of them, in their own way, were building bridges. One spring afternoon, a delegation of important men from the East arrived. A Harvard professor, a wealthy philanthropist, and a United States senator had come to see the Montana miracle for themselves. They were stunned. They saw a community built not on assimilation, but on integration, not on erasing a culture, but on celebrating it alongside another. "The key," Sam explained to them, "is respect. We didn't try to make them white. We just gave them the safety and love they needed to become the best possible versions of themselves." Thomas, now a poised and articulate young man, presented their plans for a new agricultural program that would be shared with ranchers across the territory. The senator, a man named Bradley who had been skeptical of the whole endeavor, looked at Thomas with a mixture of awe and something else, regret. "Young man," he said slowly, "20 years ago, I was one of the men who advocated for the federal boarding school program. I believed it was the only way to prepare your people for the modern world. I see now," he said, his gaze sweeping over the thriving school and the happy, confident children, "that we were profoundly, tragically wrong. It was a moment of justice, of quiet, powerful vindication." Later that evening, the family gathered for dinner. The conversation was lively, filled with plans and dreams. But Thomas was quiet. After dinner, he joined Sam on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains. "They offered me a job," Thomas said, his voice low. "The territorial government, assistant to the Commissioner of Agriculture. A chance to take what we've learned here and apply it across the territory." Sam felt a sharp pang in his chest, a mixture of pride and the inevitable sorrow of letting go. "What do you want to do?" "I want to make a difference," Thomas said. "But this is my home. I don't want to leave you." Sam put a massive hand on the young man's shoulder. "Son," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "the whole point of raising children is to prepare them to fly. This ranch isn't just a piece of land. It's an idea, and it's time for that idea to spread. You need to go. As darkness fell, Sam looked out at the empire of love he had built. The lonely giant who once ached with grief was now the patriarch of a sprawling, vibrant clan. He had been transformed by the simple act of saying yes to 12 starving children. They had come to him for food, and in return, they had taught him that a heart is not measured by its size, but by how much love it can hold. They had saved each other. The story of Big Sam Mackenzie and his 12 children became a legend in Montana, a testament to the fact that family isn't about the blood you share, but the love you choose to give. It proved that sometimes the biggest people truly do have the biggest hearts, and that a single act of compassion can be enough to change the world. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We believe in the power of stories like this one, and we have so many more to share with you. Click that bell so you don't miss a single one.